It was a grief that gripped our area. A fire in Waldo Canyon that defied physics. How did one plume become Colorado's most destructive wildfire at that time?
There was heavy suspicion that this was human-caused.
Oh my God. This is literally at the top of our street.
A decade later, where does the investigation stand today?
I know people want to know what investigators know.
Why don't we have more information about how it started?
From the recovery and rebuilding that's taken years.
There's a lot of people who are just simply trying to get out of the neighborhood.
And current evacuation plans.
The question, could we experience another? And what's being done to prevent it? Waldo's Inferno 10 years later, a KRDO News Channel 13 special.
Thank you for joining us for our special broadcast, Waldo's Inferno 10 years later. I'm Heather Skoll.
And I'm Bart Bedsole. The Waldo Canyon Fire scorched 18,000 acres, destroyed hundreds of homes, and even turned deadly.
As we mark the 10th anniversary, we take a look at where we are today, the recovery, new concerns, and how to keep a fire like this from happening again. We start with a look back on that summer that forever changed Colorado Springs. That last week of June 2012 was beyond hot. The Pikes Peak region had seen multiple fires in Teller County, thought to have been set by an arsonist. And it was safe to say first responders were on edge.
We had actually 7 in an hour and 45 minutes.
Tapering off towards the weekend, Friday, June 22nd, calls came in to the Manitou Springs Fire Department. There was smoke in the Waldo Canyon Pyramid Mountain area. Firefighters dispatched to the area looking until dark, but unable to find flames.
By noon the next day, Saturday, June 23rd, 911 lines were lighting up, a sizable plume of smoke towering above the Rampart Range. Temperatures soared to 100 degrees, and given the red flag warning that day, there was no hesitation. The Cedar Heights neighborhood, Garden of the Gods, and parts of Mountain Shadows would be put on mandatory evacuations. Strangely, hikers were still on the Waldo Canyon Trail itself. In the overnight hours, areas east would become tourist attractions in their own, an outlook towards the ever-expanding Waldo Canyon Fire.
Sunday, the 24th, another red flag warning day. Highway 24 would be locked down, closed to traffic for a week.
Our suitcases are packed. My husband's got our scrapbooks.
Towns along Ute Pass, Cascade, Green Mountain Falls, and Manitou Springs all cleared out as well.
Monday, June 25th, the third consecutive day of red flag warnings. Hot temperatures and erratic winds continued. The fire made a run towards Eagle Lake Camp and Rampart Reservoir.
Tuesday, June 26th, a day of tremendous loss for Colorado Springs. The fourth day of red flag warnings, temperatures soared to 101 degrees. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Waldo Canyon Fire had reached the top of Queens Canyon.
Oh, it's unbelievable to watch out here. I'm actually a little bit anxious standing in this evacuation area.
Simultaneously, a collapsing thunderstorm pushed the winds up to 65 miles per hour down the Rampart Range. Conditions deteriorated in minutes. That day, the fire more than tripled in size. It was a race to get everyone out, a staggering 26,000 people. Roads were clogged. It took many an hour to get out.
There's smoke in the air, so bad.
The sky, a blood orange red. The fire would hopscotch certain neighborhoods, leaving some homes obliterated, others seemingly untouched. That day, 347 homes would be completely destroyed. That day, William and Barbara Everett would also perish in the fire. They were found days later inside their Rossmere Street home, not far from the Flying W. Miraculously, there were no major injuries reported by first responders, even though many firefighters worked multiple 24-hour shifts with little to no rest.
The next day, Wednesday, then Governor John Hickenlooper declared the Waldo Canyon Fire a disaster emergency. The days that followed would bring into clearer focus the scope of the damage.
How y'all doing?
President Barack Obama would also arrive personally, thanking firefighters.
Slowly, one by one, evacuees were allowed to return to their properties, some returning only to a vacant lot. It would take until July 10th before the fire was declared fully contained, even though it continued to smolder well into the fall months. Despite the loss of homes, firefighters are credited with saving hundreds more, some of them never leaving Waldo Canyon and sleeping in the forest in between shifts as the fire raged.
One of the very first firefighters to see the smoke from the fire is now the fire chief in Colorado Springs. The Waldo Canyon Fire wasn't always this big. It started small, and Fire Chief Randy Royal was among the first to spot it on the morning of Saturday, June 23rd, not too far north of Highway 24.
At that point, it was a really tight column going straight up in the air. But as soon as I saw it, I got this sick feeling in my stomach because I knew it was going to be bad.
The immediate concern was the Cedar Heights neighborhood up the hill from Garden of the Gods Park.
So at that point, we called out multiple alarms of wildland firefighters and equipment and called for air support, and then also called for the evacuation of Cedar Heights.
Due to their efforts, not a single home was lost in Cedar Heights. And at that point, the fire itself seemed to change directions, moving to the north and west. But then early Tuesday, Royal remembers having another bad feeling, watching the wind push it back to the east.
This was like 3 in the morning. It was still like 80 degrees out, so abnormally high temperatures. We could see the column was moving more to the northeast, so we knew it was changing direction, and based on what the predicted weather was for the next day, we thought the winds could take this in.
And they don't want this fire crossing Flying W Ranch Road, otherwise it'll take out all these homes.
Footage captured by a firefighter with the department shows crews battling the blaze as it tore through parts of the west side Tuesday afternoon and evening. Crews cut through fences to save as many homes as possible, but the conditions in mountain shadows eventually forced them out.
You can see the sparks flying all over the place. It was raining fire down on us.
At that point, there's hundreds and hundreds of houses that were either on fire or being threatened by fire, and we threw everything we had in there, resource-wise and crew-wise, to try to save as many houses as we could.
Firefighters would spend the next few hours protecting what was left. Even trainees at the academy were called in to help.
This will be the first fire, and he did it. This is the first fire he's ever put out as a CSFD firefighter, not yet sworn in, but he did it.
Hundreds of firefighters were out there for 6 days straight with little to no sleep.
I mean, we lost close to 400 homes, but we saved probably 12 to 1,500 homes from burning down. Ones that had, fire against them and were on fire, and we were able to get it stopped.
Like so many others, the Albers family also lost their home. They were hopeful that somehow, some way, their home where they had lived for 22 years would be spared. Sadly, they too had to start over from scratch.
We had this most amazing white fir.
It was a landmark, that tree.
That was 30, 40 feet tall.
Synonymous with Ashton Park Place here in Mountain Shadows, it stood tall and strong, a sort of lighthouse for the locals.
People used to know it by the Christmas tree.
So much has changed since then. Pages of change, in fact.
We documented the whole building process.
Like most tragedy, it takes time to digest.
Probably 7 years before I could actually look at the photos and put it into an album.
It's been 10 years, a decade, since Mark and Carla Albers lost their home. And to this day, how it all unfolded is still fresh in their minds. June 23rd, 2012, they were camping at Lake McConaughey in Nebraska. A typical summer when they got a call from a neighbor in Mountain Shadows.
His mom texted me a picture of the smoke. And she said, "We don't know what's going on or if there's going to be an evacuation, but just so that you know." They got photo albums. I'm a cellist. They got my 2 cellos.
Mark and Carla made their way back home and packed some financial items. Life continued on.
You never have that feeling that it's going to happen to you. I mean, and I think that was just the big thing. It's like, they're not going to let houses burn, and it's off in a distance, and we're far enough away that it just wasn't, didn't seem like a reality at that point. So I went to work.
Off to work like so many others. But it would all change Tuesday afternoon.
Steve Bach interrupted the FEMA guy, and he's like, "You're on mandatory evacuation now." I finally opened up the garage, and I look out, and the fire's coming down the foothills. I did not understand how bad it was.
The Inferno was at their doorstep. Flames crowning over the hill. Carla would gather a few shorts and t-shirts, throwing picture albums in their truck.
At that point, you really start to get panicky. That drive out was scary just because there were so many people. The longer it went, it was dark, kind of orange-brown, and got darker and darker.
They made it out with hundreds of their neighbors. It would be days later. Their fears were confirmed.
So I found an aerial photograph from the Denver Post, and I just burst into tears. It's like, yeah, it's gone.
They, along with their neighbors, were eventually let back in. That same house, that same place they bought as newlyweds before there were pets and kids and memories, was ash. And so was that tree. Then began the arduous task of logging and remembering everything for insurance.
You know you've lost everything, but you don't know everything you've lost because you can't remember.
There was the irreplaceable, things that give a person context and history. There was also the mundane that was lost.
And so that became the thing. Was this before the fire or after the fire? Did we replace that?
Sometimes they only discovered what was missing in the moment.
He brought home a pizza not long after we'd moved in. We didn't have a pizza cutter, so I have a picture of him with scissors on the pizza.
Less than a year after the fire, Mark and Carla moved into a lot next door. Their neighbors couldn't bear the thought of returning. A new home with new memories here on Ashton Park Place, with a blank slate, but also with a renewed sense of what is their foundation.
Really, it's relationships and friendships and good family memories that are more important than the things that you have.
3 months after the fire, investigators determined it was caused by human activity. Since then, little to no details have come out.
Today, the Waldo Canyon Fire is still an active case at the Colorado Springs Police Department. And as we learned from the police chief, closing the case now relies more on the public than it does detectives. The fact that the Waldo Canyon Fire is such an important part of our city's history is not the only reason this photo hangs on the wall of the police chief's office, as the former head of the Violent Crimes Division, Adrian Vasquez, oversaw the case for years, and his own neighborhood, Peregrine, just south of the Air Force Academy, was among the areas evacuated.
I was here at work, rushed home to evacuate my home, my dogs, and my family.
Once they were out of harm's way, he headed back to work to help get people out. Very early on, CSPD was chosen to handle the case because of the potential for a homicide if anyone didn't survive. And soon after that, the two victims of the fire, William and Barbara Everett, were found. But today, the case is still unsolved.
We know a lot.
According to the chief, CSPD knows exactly where in Waldo Canyon the fire started, and they know it was caused by a person, not lightning, and this was not an area known for camping.
You can see the water dropping.
But beyond that, few details have ever been shared. We asked why.
The ability, if needed, to prosecute the case.
The chief explained that if they did release additional details publicly and the case eventually went to trial, some defense attorney could simply claim that their client or a supposed witness heard those details on the news and wasn't actually there. By keeping those details private, CSPD can be certain that if someone does come in with information that matches the scene that day, then that person was there or knows who was.
I understand the frustration of not knowing what happened, and I know people want to know what investigators know, but please understand that the reason we're not releasing that information is so that if somebody does come forward with information, we can be ready to hold somebody accountable. Everybody deserves some closure on this, and I hope we get that someday.
The chief says even if you have information that you think police already know, but you're not certain, they still want to hear from you. It just may be the key to moving this case forward.
Signs of the destruction are still very apparent here in Waldo Canyon, even a decade later. Still ahead, recovery efforts to restore the once popular hiking trail, and an iconic landmark rises from the ashes.
Also, new concerns about another Waldo Canyon fire and the time it would take to evacuate people in a city seeing tremendous growth. Next, when Waldo's Inferno, 10 years later, continues. Welcome back to our special, Waldo's Inferno 10 years later. There's no denying that Colorado Springs is seeing a lot of growth, with more people moving to the area than ever before.
Colorado Springs is the second fastest growing city in the state, with El Paso County being the most populous county in Colorado. The latest U.S. Census numbers show Colorado Springs' population is just under 484,000 people. That's over 51,000 more people, or a nearly 12% increase from 2012 when the Waldo Canyon Fire happened. This has only fueled concerns about another major wildfire and what it would take to safely evacuate everyone. Those concerns were highlighted in a special report from our investigative team last fall. We obtained the study of evacuation times several weeks before it was presented to Colorado Springs City Council. Here's 13 Investigates' Dan Beatty.
In an evacuation, you have a mass of people leaving at the same time.
They must have told all these people to leave too.
All trying to go the same direction, and many of them are panicking.
Mike Robinson is a professor at Old Dominion University. Robinson was hired by the group West Side Watch to study some of the most wildfire-prone neighborhoods in the city. His objective, find the evacuation clearance times, or how long it would take all residents to get out of a specific neighborhood and reach a safe place. Robinson focused on two areas on the west side of Colorado Springs. District 1, which includes neighborhoods from the Air Force Academy all the way down to Garden of the Gods Road, and the Broadmoor District, which includes the Broadmoor Bluffs, Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, and the Broadmoor Resort. Robinson's team conducted a variety of scenarios, with and without accidents, number of tourists, and how many people were in each vehicle. For District 1, some of the most conservative models showed it would take law enforcement 4 hours and 20 minutes to evacuate everyone if there were 1.5 people in each vehicle. Evacuation simulations found that Garden of the Gods Road, Centennial, Woodman, and Rock Rimmon were highly congested and get worse the closer you get to I-25. In the Broadmoor District, simulations found that Cheyenne Boulevard and West Cheyenne Road became more problematic the closer you got to Highway 115. The study finds Broadmoor Resort evacuees, and to a lesser extent evacuees from Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, have a significant impact on evacuation times.
If you add those people in, the time to evacuate the Broadmoor region is greatly increased because of the number of vehicles that are added to the road. I think it would be over 5 hours.
When we asked if these evacuation times are acceptable, here's what the man behind the study had to say.
It's really not a fair question, because I could say, well, I think it ought to be, an hour. I'm not qualified to set that. That needs to be set by a fire expert. But if I lived on the western side of that district, I wouldn't be very comfortable. What I hope that the leaders in Colorado Springs will recognize is that it takes a long time to get everybody out safely, longer than most of them seem to anticipate.
Colorado Springs Fire Chief Randy Royal says a smooth evacuation effort is more dependent on an informed public and following evacuation guidance. He says projected evacuation times don't factor in all the variables that go into each wildfire.
Our only concern is, what do you do with that information based on that modeling? Because it doesn't help us at the point in time. At the point in time, we have to use what's in front of us and the conditions that are in front of us.
Dan Beatty, 13 Investigates.
Beyond just planning for the worst, the threat of another Waldo Canyon has led to action at both the state and local level.
Next, the steps being taken right now in Colorado Springs, and an update on the recovery efforts to restore Waldo Canyon to what it once was, when Waldo's Inferno 10 years later continues.
A decade after the destruction, the recovery of Waldo Canyon is still underway.
As you can see, the burn scar and dead trees standing in Waldo Canyon are still very apparent today. The historic 7-mile Waldo Canyon trailhead, which began at Highway 24, never reopened after the fire and remains closed to this day. The fire damage and then erosion and flooding which followed have nearly obliterated the trail, creating accessibility and safety concerns. The Forest Service tells us the city of Colorado Springs recently purchased a piece of land and they are working to find a new trailhead location. But there is no timeline as to when the recreational areas of Waldo will reopen to the public. The last few years have focused on restoring the land to promote new growth and reduce flooding and runoff. With little vegetation, heavy erosion of the soil has made it difficult for any new vegetation to grow. Forest experts say a full recovery is likely to take many decades.
One of the first confirmations of damage we got during the Waldo Canyon fire was the Flying W Ranch. That Tuesday, the fire came racing down the Rampart Range. We knew there would be losses.
And yet, when we heard it was gone, it was a moment where we all felt vulnerable. The fire that was once far off had now claimed one of our area's most iconic landmarks. Now, after being shuttered for years, the ranch is back to doing what it does best.
Hello, do you have reservations?
I do. If you didn't know,
You have handicap parking.
time travel
You're going to be following that dirt road onto the left.
Is real, but only in certain spots, and this is one of them. Tucked back away from the busy city life is this oasis, a frontier of babbling brooks, farm animals, and native history. They call it the Flying W Ranch. Hard to believe what this place has been through, seeing as busy and bustling as it is now. It was just 10 years ago, this landmark was devoured by the Waldo Canyon Fire, one of the first places known to have fallen to the Inferno.
60 years to build and 60 seconds to destroy. So ever since the fire started on that Saturday, I was constantly saying it's not going to come to the ranch, it's not going to come to the ranch, it's impossible, it's not going to happen.
Aaron Winter, the Flying W general manager, along with his team, took on the role of Noah and the Ark, evacuating their animals the day the fire started.
Our goats and our ducks and our turkeys.
Their antiquities loaded up too. But then that Tuesday came. Aaron remembers exactly where he stood when the fire came over the hill.
And the fire came right in that bowl, straight down.
Incredibly, not one animal perished in the fire. And the one building they weren't able to get antiquities out of, Marion's cooking library, survived.
When we walked in there, it was as if nothing had happened. The fire didn't even happen.
But Waldo would shutter the grounds for 9 years, replacing those storied buildings with ash. But that's not where the ranch would remain. It took years of work and rebuilding, fueled by volunteers, most from our community, log by log, and after work that seemed would never end. A literal rising from the ashes. While reminders of Waldo still remain, starting its 70th season, the Flying W is strong and resilient, serving up unforgettable memories and melodies. A living exhibit, an ode to the Old West.
Had the Waldo Canyon fire happened today, the Colorado Springs fire chief believes it would not have exploded into what it became. He points to aircraft and drones now available to better spot fires early, a big issue during Waldo Canyon.
But the fire chief cautions that there are still plenty of areas left to burn, and another significant wildfire is still a possibility.
Getting ahead of another potential disaster is now the focus for emergency officials and elected leaders in Colorado Springs and across the state.
From new legislation to $20 million in fire mitigation, 13 Investigates' Dan Beatty explains the specific steps being taken to prevent another major wildfire.
The city of Colorado Springs' top priority is right here. Fisher's Canyon, 125 acres, needs to be mitigated west of Broadmoor Bluffs neighborhoods. Fire experts believe efforts here will protect thousands of homes for years to come. Fisher's Canyon will be one of the first projects to use a portion of the $20 million approved by Colorado Springs voters last fall for fire mitigation efforts.
Right now, that is a heavily overgrown forest that we have in our community. Take some of those trees down, some of the brush.
Part of the initiative that was passed also created a citywide and regional wildfire mitigation and prevention committee. It's made up of emergency and community leaders in El Paso County who will then give insight on how to use the funds meant for mitigation efforts.
I'm not aware of another community in the United States that has this significant wildfire risk that has $20 million, so to speak, in the bank to be able to dedicate to mitigation.
13 Investigates was given a copy of the cost breakdown of the first $1 million scheduled to be spent by the end of this year. On top of the $500,000 towards Fisher's Canyon, $160,000 will go towards a new crew to carry out the clearing of trees and brush in the region, and $175,000 for new equipment, including a dump truck and chipper. At the state capitol, new bills focused on wildfire mitigation have now been signed into state law by the governor. The bills provide funds for outreach to the public to educate homeowners and landowners on what they can do to prevent wildfires in their area. Another bill creates a new grant program that matches or exceeds what local governments spend on fire prevention with state money. The hope that getting ahead of potential risks will prevent the devastation of another Waldo Canyon. Dan Beatty, 13 Investigates.
A decade later, it's clear the devastation of the Waldo Canyon fire will continue to have lasting impacts in our area. It's a story of great loss, recovery, and now action in the hopes of preventing another wildfire of this magnitude.
For more Waldo Canyon coverage, you can find exclusive drone video, stories, and extended interviews on our streaming platforms. Just go to KRDO.com for more information. That'll do it for our special Waldo's Inferno, 10 years later. Thanks for joining us.